Well, good morning, or afternoon now. Delighted to be here in Rio to share this occasion with you. Delighted for a number of reasons. Firstly, to have a chance to celebrate with Co-an all the amazing work of the Sustainable Brands Initiative, which has grown and grown and grown over the last few years, as you know, and is really now making an enormous difference in terms of helping people to understand what sustainability really means. And secondly, great for me to be back here in Rio. I've visited a number of times over the years, but obviously every time I come back here, it reminds me most powerfully of the Earth Summit in 1992 when I was here, 10 years into my environmental career, and beginning to understand some of the complexities that we face. And I want to come back to where Co-an started us, to inject a little bit of sobering reality into our deliberations this morning. Co-an reminded us that the gap between what we need to be doing and what we are doing is not getting any smaller. Indeed, in many respects, that gap actually widens year on year, despite the fact that a very large number of companies now are very involved in the whole sustainability story. And so I want to unpack perhaps a slightly uncomfortable suggestion to you this morning, that we've had roughly 25 years of corporate sustainability. When I was here in Rio in 1992, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, one of the predecessor bodies, I guess, for Co-an, had just been formed in 1990. It organized a huge conference here in Rio at the time, and there was a tremendous sense of the new energy that was going to be injected into the sustainability debate from the corporate world, emphasizing the business case for sustainable development. 25 years on, I begin to detect what I can only describe as a note of complacency in the world of corporate sustainability. Fórum for the Future works a lot with companies all around the world. That's what we do. We're a not-for-profit that challenges companies to reach out and do a lot more than they might otherwise be tempted to do. And I must admit that reaching out and pushing is all the more important now than it's ever been before. We've detected what I can only describe as a note of, we've got this covered, guys. The corporate sustainability world, the big companies, perhaps not so much the smaller companies, but the big companies are out there saying, we've got this covered. We've got all this sustainability stuff nicely captured on our risk registers. We're enjoying all the benefits of the increased efficiencies in our supply chain, in our cost management. That's all playing very well inside the business and with shareholders, and why wouldn't it? It actually makes us even more efficient. We're good at doing all of this stuff with stakeholders. We love stakeholders. We love to embrace the widest possible number of stakeholders and bring them into our company and celebrate this amazing work that we're actually doing today. We know that we're doing as much as our consumers ask us to do, because consumers aren't asking us to do very much. We know we're doing as much as our investors are asking us to do, because our investors are asking us to do practically nothing. And we know we're way ahead of governments, because governments basically don't seem to demonstrate any leadership in this area whatsoever. So we've got it sorted. It's a done deal. Corporate sustainability, nicely fixed. And yet, meanwhile, as you know, going on, right over their shoulders, the physical world is falling to pieces even faster than it was falling to pieces back in 1992. And many of these issues regarding social injustice and inequity are out there visibly in our eyes all the time. And yet the corporate contribution to addressing inequity is negligible. So it seems to me that this is a really interesting moment to be thinking about sustainable brands and to be thinking about corporate sustainability in general, because this is not a good time to be giving in to that kind of complacency. We know absolutely for sure today that any kind of business as usual model means that we are basically all screwed. Even mitigated business as usual, i.e. a little bit nicer, a little bit less negatively impactful on the world, we are still all screwed. Even a radically mitigated business as usual model means that we are all screwed. So those who suggest that this emergence of corporate sustainability in our world has made a massive and all-changing difference to the cause of sustainability need, I think, to look again at what is really happening. I get the impression that a lot of these companies are just taking things a little bit too easily. They've allowed themselves to come together, and instead of really challenging the symptoms of environmental and social decline, they're actually part of a consensus view that allows that to be perpetuated. It's almost as if a bunch of really nice people had come into the last chance saloon, and instead of really doing anything very much about it, were sitting around having a nice cup of tea. Now, this really worries me. It worries me, for instance, through Fórum for the Future and the work we do. It worries me that so few companies are prepared to speak out, are prepared, if you like, to call out those carbon criminals in the world today. Why do we hear so little corporate criticism of the world of fossil fuels, of companies like Shell, of companies like ExxonMobil, of companies, dare I say it here in Brazil, such as Petrobras? Why do we hear other companies hardly ever calling them out for the damage that they're doing to the world today? Why do we hear so few companies actually calling out the insanity of conventional investment markets that think we can go on having exponential economic growth year on year indefinitely into the future? Why do we hear so few companies challenging the obvious idiocy of permanent economic growth? And why do we hear so few business leaders calling out the cowardice and weakness of governments that will not regulate for minimum standards in the world today? We don't hear that voice. We hear a lot about corporate sustainability done in all sorts of interesting ways, but we don't really hear that voice. So for me, when I come to events like this, I too want to celebrate the amazing work that is being done by corporate leaders, both in the big corporate sector and in the small startups and more disruptive sector. I want to celebrate that. But I also want to remind people that there's a very different story out there which doesn't yet put the corporate world on the side of sustainability in the way that it really needs to do. So is that changing? How do we begin to look at something that takes us beyond today's creeping incrementalism, as I call it, step by little step? How do we get beyond that? How do we get to a world where we're actually changing business models completely, rather than allowing this incrementalism to slow us all down still? How do we get a more pluralistic, inclusive approach to these new business models to achieve this kind of breakthrough? Now, we all know that framing this is really important. Getting the communications about this is absolutely right. But we know, too, that you cannot put communications before solid, intellectual, robust framing throughout a company today. Some companies are really beginning to do this now. They are really beginning to take on that intellectually robust approach. Koan mentioned the proliferation of all the different ways of interpreting sustainability out there today, and that is good. Some of them are decidedly flaky. They are intellectually corrupt from top to finish. Some of them are intellectually robust and actually look realistically in a very hard-edged way at what sustainability means in practice. We need to be very critical of those interpretations of sustainability that are all froth, just that little frothy bit on the top of a cappuccino. We have to call out those flaky definitions of sustainability, because otherwise the people who are doing the really hard work don't get the credit they deserve for digging in and making that story really work for them. Moving beyond incrementalism is not easy. When I see a company doing it, I really want to celebrate it. So just a couple of examples today. With IKEA, for instance, a very large global company now, decided that it couldn't really go on just doing any more incrementalism. So it made two big decisions. One, it said we're going to be a 100% renewable energy company. So all this stuff about climate change, we have to address this. We have to decarbonize completely. No use of fossil fuels. Secondly, they decided that wasn't good enough. So they decided that what they would then do would be to produce more renewable energy than they consume themselves. So they would be net positive in terms of the contribution to decarbonization. And thirdly, they went one step further, which is the one I'm really enjoying at the moment, which was the announcement they made 2 weeks ago, where they decided that anybody who wanted to go and buy lighting appliances, so light bulbs, in an IKEA store, would only be able to buy LED, light-emitting diode light bulbs. You would not be able to get compact fluorescence. You would not be able to get the old incandescent light bulbs. If you go to an IKEA store, that's the deal. This is a very interesting innovation, because what it basically means is they're editing the choices of consumers. They're saying you may want to buy this crap, these incandescent light bulbs and these compact fluorescents, but you can't. Not here. If you want to buy that rubbish, you're going to have to go somewhere else to buy it. And importantly then, they've innovated a lot to keep driving the cost down. So one 60-watt LED now is retailing at $4.50, which is not that different from the alternative, less sustainable alternatives that you can get. I like that example of a company that reaches out, understands what net positive means, understands what it needs to do for its consumers. We do have a handful of companies, big companies like this. I'm not talking today about the niche brands who I think are doing fantastic work, and every time I come to Brazil, I celebrate what a company like Natura is doing. Every time I go to conferences, I celebrate what a company like Patagonia is doing. But for me, the reality really is in the big guys, is how fast they can actually move. So don't please get me wrong about this. I'm absolutely here to celebrate the success of the corporate sector in advancing sustainability issues today, because they are making a real difference. But we're looking for a different quality of leadership. And for me, a lot of that comes down to the work that we do through Fórum for the Future with a handful of real outstanding leaders. And as soon as you see what that quality of leadership looks like, you know the gap between that leadership and the leadership that is there in many other companies. Chief executives are critical to this agenda. You all know that. We've learnt it over the last 25 years. Without a really purpose-driven chief executive, you cannot bring the sustainability story for a company alive. You cannot make purpose-driven brands come alive without having a purpose-driven CEO. And yet we've got a lot of CEOs out there still saying how good their companies are, how important their brands are, who don't really buy it. And yet when you think about what millennials are asking today, what younger consumers are asking today, we know that the thing they most want is that sense of purpose, that sense of a company through its brands making a real difference in the world today. There's a very simple notion behind this, that the world's most loved brands in the future will be those that are renowned for fixing problems, not for creating novelty. Some CEOs really get this. They really get this. It's the contribution their brands can make to fixing the problems of the world today, helping to fix those problems in a really substantive fashion. So we need to celebrate those leaders. I was in Sao Paulo yesterday. I was doing a whole day's workshop with Unilever. Unilever is one of the companies that I've worked with since 1997, advising on sustainability in every aspect of what that company does. And for me, it's been absolutely fascinating to see that journey in that one company. Unilever was always pretty good at sustainability, but it wasn't until Paul Polman arrived as chief executive 5 years ago that the company began to turn itself into a company that does sustainability for real around the world. It's a very different feeling. It's a very different feeling. And I've come to see just how critical that kind of leadership really is. So for chief sustainability officers out there today, you have to get your CEO absolutely aligned with this, because otherwise it's extremely difficult to see how the net corporate contribution to a more sustainable world will actually match the nature of the challenge that we face today. That's a big task. I sometimes don't envy chief sustainability officers in needing to get their CEOs with them, because it isn't always easy. But we have to do that. We have to get them informed. We have to get them inspired. And then we have to get them out there as a much more articulate part of explaining to people what sustainability is all about. Thank you.